She left me with nothing, no warning, no explanation. Then the lottery. 20 million. Her family wanted it all. They made one mistake, they thought I was weak. I always thought I was a decent guy. Grew up on the right side of the tracks, worked hard, stayed out of trouble. A simple guy. I never expected to find myself in the middle of the mess I'm in now. Let me backtrack. I'm Lucas. And my life was a series of straightforward events until I met Sabrina. The woman who would change everything. It wasn't love at first sight, not at all. But it was something. The first time we met, she was sitting alone at a cafe, scribbling something in a notebook. She had this intense look, like she was solving a puzzle no one else could see. I sat down next to her, offered to buy her coffee, and she barely looked up. I wasn't deterred. I'd gotten used to rejection, and frankly, I was a patient guy. After a couple of minutes of awkward silence, she finally spoke. Are you going to just sit there, or do you want to make yourself useful? I blinked, not expecting that. But I gave a smile. What can I do? You can get me a refill, she said, looking up. She smiled as if she had already won a game I didn't even know I was playing. That was it. That was the spark. We got to talking. She wasn't like anyone I had ever met. Sabrina came from a world of luxury, but she didn't flaunt it. She was sarcastic, funny, and smart as hell. Everything I wasn't used to, but everything I craved. I was just your average guy, working at a local tech startup, trying to make my way. Sabrina, though? She didn't need to try. She was born with everything: wealth, influence, the kind of connections that made heads turn. But there was more to her than that. Sabrina was complex. She'd been raised in a family of overachievers, people who never settled for less than the best. Her father, Gregory, was a venture capitalist. Her mother, Carla, a former supermodel turned entrepreneur. Both of them were controlling, demanding, and had this need to own everything. I should have known better. But then, there was Sabrina. I didn't care about the family drama, the wealth, the superficial trappings. I cared about her. But what I didn't know then was that her family was about to make everything much more complicated than I could have ever imagined. It started with the engagement. She said yes, and for a while, everything seemed perfect. The wedding planning was a whirlwind, but Sabrina was all in. Her parents, on the other hand, weren't thrilled. Gregory was especially hands-on, offering advice on every detail, from the flowers to the menu. It was clear he didn't think I was good enough, but he was too polite to say it out loud. Carla, however, was more direct. You're not good enough for her, she once said to me, casually, as if discussing the weather. But you're here now, so I suppose we'll make it work. That was the moment I should have run. But I didn't. I loved Sabrina. Or at least, I thought I did. Then came the prenuptial agreement. At first, I thought it was a formality, a paperwork issue. They insisted it wasn't anything personal. But Gregory made sure to highlight the clauses that mattered. This, he pointed to one section, is to protect Sabrina from any financial mishaps. You wouldn't want to burden her with anything, would you? I wasn't in a position to argue. The prenup was airtight. Everything she had, her family's money, properties, investments, remained hers, no matter what. If we ever split, I would be entitled to nothing but what I brought into the marriage. In return, I got her. Or so I thought. I convinced myself that love could overcome everything. That a piece of paper didn't matter. But as I signed the document, I had this nagging feeling. Deep down, I knew something was off. Something that would come back to bite me. And, of course, I was right. Years passed, and life unfolded like it does for most couples. We settled into a rhythm. Sabrina and I lived in a beautiful penthouse apartment downtown, one of the ones her parents helped fund, though technically, I paid the bills. We never talked about money directly, but the tension was there. Her parents would drop by unannounced, rearrange our furniture, buy new things without asking. It didn't matter what we wanted, it was always about what they thought we needed. Then, everything changed. Sabrina came home one night, glowing. She could barely contain her excitement. Lucas, I won. I won the lottery. She waved the ticket in my face like it was a golden ticket to a new life. I stared at her, trying to process the words. She had won $20 million, not just some small prize. My mind raced with possibilities, dream vacations, freedom, a new start. This was it. We were set. But Sabrina's reaction was strange. She became secretive. The more I pushed her for details, the more distant she got. We need to keep this quiet, she insisted. There are things I need to handle first. I didn't understand why. We were supposed to celebrate together, but Sabrina shut me out of the process. Let's just lay low for now, she said. We don't want to draw attention. But that didn't stop me from wondering. Then came the day that turned everything upside down. I came home after work to find Sabrina packing her bags. I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to make sense of it. "What's going on?" I asked. Sabrina turned to me, her face unreadable. "I'm filing for divorce." My heart skipped a beat. "What? Divorce? Sabrina, what are you talking about?" She didn't answer, just kept packing her things. "You need to leave. It's over, Lucas. You're out." I was in shock. Everything felt like it was crumbling in an instant. The penthouse, the life we had, the love I thought we shared, it all vanished before my eyes. And then came the kicker. "My parents' lawyer is handling everything," she said, almost matter-of-factly. "I'm not going to fight you for the apartment, but we need to separate everything." I still couldn't process what was happening. But when I walked into my father-in-law's office a few days later, I realized just how far Sabrina's family had gone to protect their money. "Let's be clear," Gregory's lawyer said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. "The lottery winnings are not joint property. Sabrina will be keeping them, and you'll be entitled to nothing." I couldn't believe it. But what they didn't know, what they hadn't counted on, was the prenup. The very document they had forced me to sign years ago. It turned out, despite their legal maneuvering, that any windfalls during the marriage, including lottery winnings, were to be considered marital property. And that, my friends, was the moment I knew I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for my dignity, for my future. I spent the next few days in a haze. I couldn't believe what was happening to me. I was no longer the guy who bartended to make ends meet or managed a small sporting goods store. I wasn't the guy who had been swept up in Sabrina's charm and her family's wealth. No, now I was something different, something that Sabrina and her parents had never anticipated. I was a man with nothing to lose. I spent my days wrestling with the shock of it all and my nights thinking about the battle ahead. The truth settled in slowly, like a fog. Sabrina and her family thought they could take the winnings from the lottery and keep them all for themselves. But they forgot one crucial detail: that prenuptial agreement they forced me to sign, the one I always thought was a simple formality, was now my weapon. And so began the fight for my share of the jackpot. I knew I had to play it smart. I couldn't just charge in headfirst and expect things to work out. Sabrina's parents were too powerful, too connected. Gregory's influence in the city alone could make this process miserable for me if I wasn't careful. They'd made sure the prenup was ironclad, but it wasn't perfect. No contract ever is. My lawyer, Susan, was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s who had been recommended to me by a friend of a friend. She took one look at the prenup, and her first words were, "They've made a huge mistake." I wasn't sure what she meant, but Susan explained that the clause about lottery winnings was so poorly worded that it left the door wide open for me to challenge it. If I could prove that the money was acquired during the marriage, then it would be considered a shared asset, regardless of how Sabrina had purchased the ticket. "Your contribution to the relationship matters too," Susan said, as we sat in her sleek, minimalist office. "You helped with the mortgage, with living expenses. And don't let them convince you otherwise. We've got a solid case, Lucas." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't completely powerless. But I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Sabrina and her family were already preparing for battle. I could feel it in every conversation, in every message I received from their attorneys. They were relentless. They accused me of being a gold digger, of scheming to get my hands on money that wasn't mine. They portrayed me as someone who never cared about Sabrina, just about her wealth. I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a smooth negotiation. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about dignity, about proving that I wasn't the naive, easily manipulated man they thought I was. It was personal. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, phone calls, and documents. Susan worked tirelessly, reviewing every aspect of our case, every little detail. Meanwhile, Sabrina's lawyers did their best to undermine me at every turn. They spread rumors about me, tried to paint me as the villain in the press, and made it clear that if I didn't settle quickly, they would make my life a living hell. But I refused to back down. One day, I received a letter from Sabrina's parents written in their signature, passive-aggressive tone. It was an offer. A settlement, they claimed, that was generous. It wasn't even enough to cover my share of the condo, but it was an attempt to buy me off. The message was clear: take the money, disappear, and don't cause any more trouble. I called Susan immediately. "What do you think?" She didn't hesitate. "Decline it. They're trying to play you for a fool. They want you to walk away quietly. But you've got leverage. Don't take their scraps." I was angry, but I also felt something else bubbling inside me: power. They thought they could manipulate me, just like they'd done with Sabrina. But I wasn't going to let them get away with it. And then came the day I'd been dreading. The hearing. I stood in front of the courthouse that morning, my nerves raw, the weight of the entire situation pressing down on me. I'd never been in a courtroom before. My life had been nothing more than a series of simple jobs, simple dreams. But now, it was different. I wasn't just fighting for money. I was fighting for respect. My parents stood behind me, their faces lined with concern but also pride. They had supported me through every twist and turn, and I couldn't have done this without them. They knew how much I loved Sabrina, how much I had believed in our marriage. But now, they were watching me face a battle that could tear our lives apart. Inside the courtroom, Sabrina was sitting at the front with her parents, flanked by their lawyers. She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge my presence. There was nothing left to say between us. But her family, they were the real problem. Gregory, sitting there with his smug expression, his hand casually resting on the back of Sabrina's chair, watching the proceedings with an air of invincibility. Carla, sitting next to him, glaring at me with the kind of icy disdain that made my blood boil. They thought they had me cornered. Susan leaned in close, her voice a soft whisper. "We've got this. Stay calm. Stick to the facts." The judge, a stern woman in her early 50s, called the session to order. She didn't waste any time. Sabrina's lawyer started with a long-winded argument, trying to claim that the lottery winnings were Sabrina's sole property, that the prenup had been violated by the idea of combining assets. They tried to make it seem like my contributions to the marriage were insignificant. I sat there, listening to their attacks, but all I could think about was how much they underestimated me. When it was my turn, Susan stood by me, presenting our case. She carefully outlined the terms of the prenup and how it clearly stated that windfalls, including lottery winnings, were marital assets unless explicitly stated otherwise. The paperwork from the bank showed that Sabrina had used our joint account to purchase the lottery ticket, making it an asset of the marriage, not just hers. I watched the judge's face as we presented our evidence. She didn't say much, but I could see the wheels turning. Sabrina's lawyers sputtered, trying to poke holes in the evidence, but it was clear they were losing ground. I could feel the tension in the room. Sabrina was shifting in her seat, her eyes now darting nervously between me and her parents. Gregory, usually calm and collected, was clenching his fists. I could tell he was losing control. They had made a critical error by pushing me too far. The judge didn't make her decision that day. But I could see the writing on the wall. She wasn't buying their narrative. We left the courthouse that afternoon with a sense of cautious optimism. The fight wasn't over, but I could feel the momentum shifting in our favor. The weeks after the hearing were a whirlwind. Every day felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the final verdict. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I knew one thing: the fight wasn't going to end quietly. Sabrina and her parents doubled down. Gregory made more attempts to intimidate me through his network of business associates. Carla sent me cold, icy messages, pretending to offer olive branches, but I saw right through it. Their attempt to paint me as a gold digger had failed in court, but they were still determined to tear me down personally. They spread rumors about me, how I was a failure, how I was using Sabrina to get rich. They tried to poison my relationships with friends and colleagues, but something in me had snapped. They had pushed me to the edge. They had underestimated me, and now I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Meanwhile, Sabrina remained silent. I still hadn't heard from her directly. After the first hearing, she had clammed up completely, her lawyers handling everything. I wasn't sure if she was ashamed or just too controlled by her parents to do anything for herself. I had hoped we could have worked things out, but the way she had so easily sided with her family, it shattered the trust one had in her. I would have liked to say that I still cared about her, but the truth was, the woman I had fallen in love with, the one I had hoped would stand by me, had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. The day of the final hearing arrived sooner than I anticipated. I hadn't expected it to feel like this, so cold, so tense. I walked into the courthouse, my palms clammy, my stomach tight with anxiety. My parents were with me, as they had been every step of the way, but I could feel their worry too. This wasn't just about money for them. This was about me. About our family. Inside the courtroom, things were already heating up. Sabrina's parents had brought a full arsenal for lawyers, financial experts, and a whole team of investigators. They were prepared for anything, but I had something they hadn't counted on: the truth. The judge called the court to order, and we all stood. As I took my seat, I couldn't help but glance over at Sabrina. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't even looking at her own parents. She sat there, completely detached, her fingers nervously tapping on the table. This was it. Her lawyer started first, trying to paint me as someone who was manipulating Sabrina into this whole situation, claiming I was a leech who'd latched onto her wealth. He went on, presenting their arguments about how the lottery winnings should remain Sabrina's separate property, how she was the one who bought the ticket, how it had been a personal victory. I was calm as I listened, but deep down, my blood was boiling. Every word they spoke, every accusation they made, felt like a personal slap in the face. When it was my turn, I stood up and walked slowly to the podium. My voice was steady, though my insides were a whirlwind of anger and frustration. I looked at the judge, then at Sabrina's family, and finally, at Sabrina herself. There was no more pretending. This wasn't about love anymore. It was about survival. Sabrina and her family, I began, my voice carrying through the room, want to present this as if I'm some opportunistic gold digger. That's what they've been trying to paint me as. But what they've forgotten, what they didn't expect, is that I was a part of this marriage too. I contributed. I paid the bills. I paid the mortgage. I helped with every damn thing. I wasn't just sitting around waiting for a handout. I paused for a moment, making sure everyone was listening. My eyes were fixed on Sabrina's father, Gregory, who was sitting there with his arms crossed, his face red with rage. The prenuptial agreement they forced me to sign, it's a joke. It's a shield for them. They wanted to protect their wealth, but now that it's clear I'm entitled to part of this, they've decided I don't deserve anything. They've tried to silence me, to intimidate me. But I won't back down. I looked over at Sabrina, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and guilt. Your parents pushed me out of our home the minute you won that money, I continued, my voice firm, but I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. You didn't even think to discuss it with me. They told me I was worthless. That I was nothing without you and your family's wealth. But I am not their puppet. And I am not yours either. I took a breath, letting the weight of my words sink in. I'm here for what's rightfully mine, and I'm not going to let anyone take that from me. Not even you, Sabrina. There was a moment of silence in the courtroom, the kind that feels like an eternity. The judge's face remained stoic, but I could see that she was paying attention. She was listening. Sabrina's lawyer sputtered, trying to reclaim the floor, but the judge raised a hand. She turned to her and said, "Please, let's move on. I've heard enough." And with that, the room fell into a tense silence. The judge called for a brief recess, and everyone stood up, gathering their things. I could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a fight for money anymore, it was a fight for respect, for my dignity. When we reconvened, the air was thick with tension. Sabrina was visibly upset now, her eyes red from crying, but she said nothing. Gregory, on the other hand, was seething. His eyes were locked on me with pure disdain. The judge called the proceedings to order. I've reviewed all the evidence presented, she began, her voice cold and authoritative. And I have made my decision. The room grew still. Based on the prenuptial agreement, it's clear that any windfall acquired during the marriage, including lottery winnings, is to be considered marital property. Both parties contributed to this marriage, and both parties will share in the assets acquired during this time. There was an audible gasp from Sabrina's family. Gregory's face went pale, but he didn't speak. Carla clenched her fists so tightly that I thought she might break something. The judge continued. As for the division of assets, considering the financial contributions made by Lucas to the household and his entitlement as outlined in the prenuptial agreement, he will receive a substantial portion of the lottery winnings. Additionally, he is entitled to his share of the mortgage and living expenses. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time in this entire process, I felt like I had finally been seen. A victory. A real one. Furthermore, the judge added, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at Sabrina's family, the actions taken to expel Lucas from the home abruptly, without proper legal grounds, are not only unfair but unlawful. I am ordering a repayment to Lucas for his share of the property, and the account should be settled within 30 days. Sabrina sat in silence, her hands shaking. I couldn't tell if she was relieved or regretful. But at this point, I didn't care. The final gavel fell, and the room emptied out. Sabrina and her family didn't speak to me. They didn't even look at me as they filed out, heads down in defeat. As I walked out of the courtroom with Susan, my heart was heavy. I had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the end of something I had once thought was the beginning of forever. It's been months since the final hearing, and I still don't know how to feel about it all. The settlement, the lottery winnings, the house, I suppose in many ways, I came out on top. But there are days when the emotional toll feels heavier than the check in my pocket, heavier than the newfound sense of freedom I've gained. After the court's decision, Sabrina's family avoided me like the plague. Gregory and Carla never reached out, never even acknowledged the final ruling. I didn't expect an apology, hell, I didn't want one. They had done enough damage already. But I couldn't ignore the void left in the wake of the entire experience. The family I had once hoped would become mine, people I thought could become part of my story, had turned out to be a nightmare. I moved into a small house in the suburbs. Modest, comfortable, a far cry from the luxury I'd been surrounded by during the last few years of my marriage. It was quiet, no constant interference from her parents, no smothering expectations. The house was mine, and it felt good to live on my own terms for once. I bought a used car that wasn't flashy but ran well, started picking up hobbies I'd left behind in the chaos of my marriage. I started taking weekends off, learning how to golf, not that I was any good at it, and took up painting. The kind of things I had always put off for later. For once, later felt like it had arrived. Still, the money was hard to enjoy at first. Every time I checked my bank account, it was like a reminder of how far I'd been pushed, how everything had crumbled around me just because Sabrina's parents feared losing control. But eventually, I realized something. They had underestimated me. The prenuptial agreement they had forced on me, the one that I thought would keep me from ever getting a share of anything, had backfired spectacularly. That's the funny thing about manipulation. When you think you're using someone, you might just end up being the one who gets burned. A couple of months after the hearing, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sabrina had started seeing someone new. Some guy from one of her father's business connections. I didn't care, though. Not anymore. I had my own life to rebuild, and I wasn't about to let her or her family's web of lies hold me down any longer. One night, I ran into her mother, Carla, at a local cafe. I had been trying to avoid places they frequented, but it was unavoidable. She was sitting at a table by the window, looking out at the street, probably waiting for one of her important friends. I hadn't seen her in months, but the moment she saw me, she froze. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, a flicker of recognition and resentment passing over her face. She hadn't expected me to be out here, a mere 2 blocks away from their world. "Lucas," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "I didn't expect to see you here." I could tell she was trying to hold on to some semblance of control. Her posture was rigid, her gaze sharp, but I could see the cracks in her armor. I nodded politely, but I didn't approach her. I had nothing left to say. "Funny," she continued, the bitterness leaking through her words, "how things turned out for you. I thought you'd be gone by now, with your tail between your legs." I almost laughed. Funny how life works, right? You think you've got everything figured out, and then one little detail changes everything. Her eyes flashed, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she finally spoke, her tone colder than ever. "I never thought you'd fight this hard. Never thought you'd have the guts to stand up to us. I guess I surprised you," I said, "but it wasn't about fighting you. It was about fighting for what's mine. Something you forgot to account for." She scoffed, picking up her glass of water and taking a sip, clearly trying to keep her composure. "It was all for Sabrina, you know. She needed protection. We needed protection." "I'm sure," I said. "But your protection came at the cost of everything I thought was real." Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second before she recovered, a bitter smile crossing her lips. "It doesn't matter now, does it? You've won. We lost." I nodded. "I didn't want to win, Carla. I just wanted to be treated fairly." She opened her mouth to respond, but then stopped herself, eyes scanning the room as though searching for something to say that could save face. It was a hollow gesture, and we both knew it. "Well, I suppose that's the end of it," she said stiffly, standing up. "You'll be fine. You always were." I watched her walk out of the cafe, her high heels clicking sharply against the floor, as she disappeared into the night. And for the first time in months, I felt at peace. It wasn't closure, not really. I wasn't sure I would ever get that from her or from Sabrina. But I had moved on, and that was enough. A few weeks later, I took a trip back to the place I grew up. My parents' house still smelled like fresh laundry and home-cooked meals, just like it always had. It was the same, but different. I was different. I had learned the hard way that life isn't always kind, and people you think you can trust might just tear you apart when things get tough. But I also learned that no one gets to dictate your future. Not even the people you love. The lottery winnings were a blessing, yes. But the real victory wasn't the money, it was the chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. It wasn't the mansion or the extravagant vacations. It was the quiet moments, the ones I had been too busy chasing other things to appreciate. The story of Sabrina and her family would always be part of my past. But I wasn't going to let it define me anymore. I was finally free.